Commander Thex looked at Earth's defenses and laughed. Soft, small, and weak. No claws, no armor, no special powers. Then Admiral Marcus Reed appeared on screen with a warning that would change everything. Humans do not give up. We rebuild, we learn, we remember. The Valdris Empire was about to discover why underestimating humanity is the deadliest mistake any species can make. The Valdris Empire dropped from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. Their fleet represented supreme confidence built over centuries of galactic conquest. They had reduced countless worlds to compliant states. This operation against Earth was logged as a standard pacification. Command anticipated minimal resistance, another routine subjugation. Scans swept the planet immediately. Sophisticated sensors sought the signatures of advanced technology. They searched for energy shield emissions, molecular disruptor arrays, or biological agent stockpiles. The readouts showed blank space where these markers should appear. The data indicated no orbital defenses, no energy weapons, no power grid strong enough to challenge their fleet systems. The tactical display painted a picture of a civilization still bound to its home world. Commander Thex studied the initial reports from his command chair. His mandibles clicked in amusement. He noted the lack of planetary shielding, the primitive satellite network. They are prey, he stated. His tone held the certainty of 7 successful campaigns. Primitive. They still use combustion for propulsion. Their weapons are chemical, not energy-based. This will require minimal force. Across the bridge, officers nodded agreement. The assessment fit their experience. Easy targets require little preparation. His junior officer, Lieutenant Krell, studied the biological scans. He noted the physical characteristics of the dominant species. No natural armor plating, he reported. No claws or significant dentition for combat. Minimal muscle density compared to standard warrior castes. Their skeletons appear fragile. They lack any natural projectile or venom systems. The data suggested a species built for endurance, perhaps, but not for direct confrontation. It was a profile they had seen before. Such species broke quickly under pressure. The tactical computer processed the environmental and technological data. It cross-referenced it against thousands of previous invasions. The recommendation appeared on Thex's main screen shortly after. Deploy 1 battle group. Full planetary pacification projected within 3 local days. Casualty estimates for fleet assets. Negligible. The algorithm considered only measurable factors. It evaluated fleet strength, visible technology, and biological aggression markers. It found no reason for caution. This analysis failed to account for what their sensors could not quantify. It ignored the historical patterns etched into Earth's very soil. It missed the geological evidence of constant brutal conflict. It did not recognize the strategic value of a planet with no unified government, but countless hidden bunkers. The assessment was a product of pure arrogance, a belief that what they could measure was all that mattered. They looked at a planet and saw a soft target. They did not see the hardened resolve forged in millennia of war. They saw primitive technology. They missed the intricate networks of tunnels and shelters built into every continent. They registered a lack of energy shields. They failed to detect the kinetic weapon systems buried deep beneath mountain ranges. Their confidence was a weapon turned against them. It created a critical blind spot in their strategic thinking. This single moment of miscalculation would dictate the entire course of the conflict. Their decision to deploy a minimal force based on a superficial reading provided humanity a critical advantage. It gave Earth time to react. It allowed their hidden defenses to activate. The Valdris had built their doctrine on overwhelming technological supremacy. They were about to learn that some enemies cannot be quantified on a sensor display. The cost of this error would be measured in ships lost and warriors dead. Their certainty had just written the first line of their defeat. They had chosen to fight a war of efficiency against an enemy that waged war of attrition. They prepared for a quick victory. Earth had spent generations preparing for an endless struggle. The stage was set not for a conquest, but for a lesson. Imperial procedure required a formal surrender demand. It was a standard part of the Valdris pacification process. An order to submit was always the first official act of an invasion. This declaration of intent set the rules of engagement. It established the invader's authority from the outset. The communication was designed to induce panic, to showcase overwhelming power. It was a psychological weapon as much as a military one. The Valdris comms officer activated the broadcast across every Earth frequency. The message was simple and direct. It demanded unconditional surrender. It listed the consequences of refusal in stark terms. The transmission was powerful, designed to override local signals. It played on emergency channels, television networks, and radio bands. It was meant to be the first thing every human heard from their new rulers. The broadcast was not a request. It was a statement of fact. A response should have followed within seconds. Panicked communications, attempts to negotiate, official pleas for mercy. Instead, the Valdris receivers detected only static. Their scanners showed Earth's communication networks were still active. Billions of data points moved across the planet, but nothing was directed at them. No signal acknowledged their demand. The silence was total and deliberate. It was the first break from their expected script. On the bridge, Commander Thex interpreted the quiet as confusion. They lack the technology to respond, he stated. Their systems cannot process our transmission format. His officers agreed. It fit their assessment of a primitive world. They saw a civilization stunned into silence by superior technology. They did not consider the silence might be a coordinated action. The idea that an entire planet could choose not to respond was alien to their thinking. Minutes passed. The lack of any reaction became unnerving. The bridge crew watched their monitors, expecting the silence to break. The tactical displays showed no change in Earth status. No military mobilization, no panic in population centers. The planet continued its normal routines as if the massive alien fleet in orbit did not exist. This was not the behavior of a species that knew it was defeated. It was the behavior of a species that was waiting. The quiet stretched from minutes into a full quarter hour. The tension on the Valdris bridge grew with each passing second. The lack of a response became a presence itself. It was a void that their sensors could not analyze. It defied all their invasion protocols. They were prepared for defiance, for negotiation, for panic. They were not prepared for absolute total silence. It suggested a level of coordination and discipline they had not anticipated. Then, without warning, their main view screen activated. The silent void was broken. A signal of tremendous power and clarity locked onto their central display. It overrode their systems with ease. The image that resolved was not one of panic or confusion. It was the face of a human male, older with steady eyes. He wore a uniform adorned with insignia they did not recognize. His expression was calm, his gaze direct. He did not look like a man who was about to surrender. Admiral Marcus Reed looked directly into the camera, as if he could see each of them. The transmission was so clean it felt like he was in the room with them. He did not speak immediately. He let his presence fill the screen, letting them absorb the fact that this was a deliberate, targeted communication. The silence had been broken not with a plea, but with a show of control. They had expected to be addressing a terrified world. Now that world was addressing them. Admiral Reed's eyes fixed on the command crew of the Valdris flagship. He spoke with no greeting. He offered no introduction. He delivered his message in a flat, measured tone, each word carrying the weight of a verdict. You are in orbit around the planet Earth. You have issued a demand for surrender. That demand is rejected. There was no anger in his voice, no fear, only the cold certainty of fact. His words cut directly against the Valdris intelligence briefing. He spoke not of weakness, but of endurance. Our history is written in conflict. We have fought ourselves for thousands of years. We have waged war across every continent, on every ocean, in the air and in space. He listed these facts as if reading from a ledger. He was not describing a vulnerable species. He was describing an organism hardened by perpetual struggle. He continued, his gaze never wavering. We have faced extinction-level events of our own making. We have recovered from global wars that left our cities in ashes and our populations shattered. Each time we returned, each time we rebuilt. This was the core of his message. It was a psychological profile of his entire species, delivered without a trace of pride. It was a simple statement of observed behavior. Then he delivered the central phrase. His voice did not rise. It did not harden. It remained a cold, clear channel of information. We rebuild, we learn, we remember. The three statements hung in the air. They were not a boast or a threat in the traditional sense. They were a declaration of immutable process. They described a cycle that was as fundamental to humanity as breathing. On the Valdris Bridge, the initial reaction was disbelief. A low chuckle came from the tactical station. Commander Thex himself smiled, a clicking sound from his mandibles. "They defy us?" he said to his officers. With words? The laughter was brief, a release of tension from the unnerving silence. It was the sound of a predator hearing its prey growl. It was amusing. It was expected. Defiance was a standard part of the script before the breaking began, but the laughter died quickly. It faded into the sterile air of the bridge because the man on the screen did not react. Admiral Reed's expression did not change. He did not glare. He did not smile at their mockery. He simply watched them. His eyes remained steady, cold, and utterly focused. The lack of reaction was more disconcerting than any shouted threat could have been. His silence after speaking suggested his words required no emphasis. They were simply true. The officers fell quiet. The humor evaporated, replaced by a slow, dawning realization. This was not the bluster of a doomed commander trying to save face. This was not a negotiation tactic. The man was not trying to persuade them to leave. He was informing them of the terms of engagement. He was outlining the nature of the conflict they had just started. He was describing a war they had not planned for. His warning was a declaration of a war not of technology but of will. It was a war not for territory but for existence. The Valdris fought wars of conquest, wars with clear victory conditions and measurable gains. The Admiral described a war of attrition, a war where the only victory condition was the enemy's complete exhaustion. It was a form of conflict their tactics, their technology, and their entire doctrine were not designed to fight. They were equipped to break armies. He was telling them they would have to break a history. Admiral Reed finished speaking. The screen did not go dark. Instead, the image of his face dissolved. The view pulled back, shifting from his steady gaze to a wider shot. It showed the familiar gray and white disk of Earth's moon. The view was crisp, from a high-orbit satellite or a telescope array. The moon hung in the blackness, pockmarked and silent. It was a passive observer, a bystander to the confrontation. Then a point of light flared on its surface. It was not a meteor impact. It was a precise, controlled event. A brilliant lance of energy, pure white at its core and tinged with blue, struck a crater basin near the lunar equator. The beam was not an emission from the Valdris fleet. Their sensors confirmed it instantly. The energy signature originated from the planet below. It was a weapon fired from the surface of Earth, traversing the void between worlds with impossible accuracy. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A square kilometer of the lunar surface ceased to exist. Rock and dust did not explode outward. They vaporized. The matter converted directly to superheated plasma, in a flash of light that left after images on the Valdris view screens. There was no sound, only the terrifying visual of a section of a celestial body being neatly erased. The flash died down as quickly as it arrived. Where there had been a crater, there was now a smoother, glacier scar, molten rock already cooling in the vacuum. This was no accidental discharge or panicked shot. It was a demonstration executed with surgical precision. The weapon was not aimed at their fleet. It was aimed at the moon for a specific reason. It was a message of capability without being an overt act of war. It demonstrated that Earth could project immense power across 250,000 miles of space. It proved their targeting systems could hit a specific point on a moving, orbiting body. The message was one of cold, calculated resolve. They were showing their fangs without yet biting. On the Valdris Bridge, all previous confidence evaporated. Scanners that had registered a primitive world minutes before now shrieked with new data. Officers called out conflicting readings. The energy output of the lunar strike dwarfed anything their initial scans had detected. It indicated a power generation capability they had completely missed. Their systems recalibrated frantically, searching for the source, trying to pierce the planetary deception. The initial assessment was now a useless document. They had to start over. Admiral Reed's face reappeared on the screen. His expression had not changed. He had just demonstrated the ability to destroy a part of a moon. He looked as calm as if he had discussed the weather. "You have 12 hours, he stated. His voice was flat, final. "Withdraw beyond the orbit of your arrival point. If any ship remains within that boundary when the time expires, we will interpret it as an act of war." The demonstration is concluded. The screen went black. The transmission ended. The bridge was utterly silent. The tactical clock on the main display reset itself. New numbers glowed a steady, ominous red. 12 hours. Or 11:59, 11:58. The countdown had begun. The ultimatum was not a plea. It was a deadline. The Valdris now understood the stakes were not about conquering a weak world. The stakes were about surviving an encounter with a hidden predator. The clock was no longer a timer for their victory parade. It was a timer for their decision to retreat or be destroyed. Every second that ticked away was a second closer to a war they suddenly realized they might not win. The lunar strike forced a complete sensor recalibration. Valdris technicians overrode the standard scanning protocols. They shifted from broad-spectrum surface analysis to deep penetration sonar and seismic imaging. They tuned their arrays to ignore the surface clutter of cities and infrastructure. They aimed to see what lay beneath the crust, to find the source of the weapon that had scarred the moon. The new scanning depth revealed a truth their first assessment had completely missed. The data that flooded their screens was not just unexpected. It redefined the entire nature of their target. The reading showed a planet honeycombed with tunnels and caverns. This was not a natural geological formation. The patterns were too regular, too deliberate. They revealed vast underground complexes spanning continents. The scans detected energy signatures from sources kilometers below the surface. They found life signs concentrated not in surface cities but in these deep shielded bunkers. Lieutenant Krell's voice was tight as he read the initial returns. "Command, we are detecting subterranean structures. Massive scale. They run beneath every major landmass." His fingers flew across his console, isolating signatures. "I'm reading power generation, industrial level output, manufacturing facilities." The data painted a picture of a second civilization existing directly below the first. The surface was not the heart of human civilization. It was its outer shell. The scans probed deeper, focusing on geological anomalies. Mountain ranges that should have been solid rock showed hollow cores. These vast internal spaces housed immense machinery. The scanners identified the unique energy signatures of planetary shield generators. They were not in orbit. They were buried deep within the planet's strongest natural formations, armored by kilometers of granite and basalt. Similar readings came from the deepest ocean trenches. Humanity had turned its own planet into a fortified position. The tactical assessment dissolved into chaos. Officers called out conflicting data points. They were not looking at a society that had just discovered spaceflight. They were looking at a society that had been preparing for an existential threat for generations. The surface cities, with their visible technology and apparent vulnerability, were a facade, a mask designed to be lost. The real civilization, the hardened, militarized core of humanity, existed safely below, immune to orbital bombardment. The initial scan had been a fatal misreading of the entire situation. Commander Thex stared at the holographic readout of Earth. It now glowed with a web of light illustrating the subterranean network. "How?" was the only word he could form. The scale of the construction was staggering. It represented centuries of coordinated effort and immense resources. This was not a project started when they detected the Valdris fleet. This was the work of decades, perhaps longer. They had not stumbled upon a primitive world. They had flown directly into a prepared kill zone. The realization was a physical blow to the command crew. Their confidence shattered. This was not a society on the brink of collapse. This was a society that had already envisioned its own end and built a new beginning deep within the Earth. They were not facing a disorganized collection of nation-states. They were facing a single, unified, and deeply entrenched enemy. The war had not begun with their arrival. Humanity had been at war with the possibility of their arrival for a very long time. They were just late to the conflict. Admiral Reed's transmission ended. On Earth, a single coded signal activated. It was not a general alarm. It was the execution command for Protocol Citadel. The 12-hour window was not a period of negotiation or fear. It was the final countdown for a planetary transformation that had been planned and rehearsed for 50 years. The clock was not for the Valdris. It was humanity's deadline to complete its transition from a surface-dwelling species to a fully mobilized planetary fortress. The change began instantly and everywhere. In every major city, calm, pre-recorded messages directed populations to evacuation points. There was no panic. Citizens moved with a practiced efficiency that spoke of countless drills. They entered subway systems that became arteries leading deep underground. Elevators descended into mountains. Submersibles dove to ocean floor facilities. The surface began to empty, its people funneling into the vast subterranean networks the Valdris scanners had just discovered. Above ground, the nature of industry changed. Automated factories that once produced consumer goods received new instructions. Assembly lines shifted from crafting vehicles to assembling armored plating. Chemical plants ceased fertilizer production and began synthesizing explosives and propellants. 3D printers in countless workshops began producing components for weapons and communication gear. The global economy, in the space of an hour, reoriented entirely around a single product: war material. Every resource was requisitioned, every facility repurposed. Deep within a command center buried under the Ural Mountains, General Patricia Vance monitored the global transition. Her headquarters was a cavernous room filled with holographic displays and data streams. She did not give dramatic speeches. She issued concise, calm orders to regional commanders. Her screen showed the progress of the evacuation, the status of shield generator activation, the output of munitions factories. She coordinated a planet's worth of movement and production as if it were a single machine. Her voice was the steady nerve center of the entire operation. The integration was total. Every person had a role. Engineers who designed skyscrapers now calculated structural stresses for bunkers. Chefs from five-star restaurants organized mass food production in cavernous underground kitchens. Students trained in basic first aid were assigned to medical bays. There were no civilians anymore. There was only the human species, and every member was a component of its defense. The division between soldier and citizen dissolved into a unified whole. From orbit, the Valdris watched this metamorphosis. Their sensors tracked the massive, coordinated movement of billions of life signs disappearing below the surface. They detected the seismic rumble of vast subterranean machinery powering up. They saw the shift in energy signatures as surface power grids went dark and deep Earth reactors reached maximum output. The planet was not preparing to defend itself. It was becoming a weapon. The scale and speed of the change was staggering. It was the most disciplined and rapid mobilization they had ever witnessed. Commander Thex finally understood the Admiral's gambit. The ultimatum was a feint. It was a way to buy time without appearing weak. By giving a deadline, Reed had forced the Valdris into a position of observation. They were obligated to wait and see if humanity would comply. That waiting period was the most valuable resource Earth could have asked for. It was the window they needed to complete their final preparations without immediate attack. As the clock on the Valdris bridge ticked down to its final minutes, the transformation was complete. The surface was largely silent, a ghost of its former self. Below, the planet thrummed with prepared violence. Shield generators were online. Weapon systems were charged and targeted. Every human was in position. The 12 hours were up. The deadline expired. The Valdris fleet had waited. Earth had not. It was no longer a planet to be invaded. It was a fortress waiting for its gates to be tested. Commander Thex gave the order. The fleet moved into attack formation. Their primary energy weapons began the power-up sequence. A low hum built through the ships as massive capacitors charged. The targeting computers locked onto the coordinates of former population centers. Capital cities, industrial zones, and transportation hubs glowed red on their tactical displays. The plan was standard: a simultaneous volley to shatter command structure and break morale. It was the opening move of every Valdris pacification. The weapons fired. Lances of concentrated plasma streaked down from orbit. They cut through the upper atmosphere, trails of superheated air glowing behind them. The energy beams were designed to vaporize armor and melt battlements. They were moments from impact, moments from scouring whole cities from the map. Then they struck an invisible wall 100 kilometers above the surface. The energy did not penetrate. It splashed against an unseen barrier, spreading out in violent ripples of light before dissipating into the void. The Valdris gunnery officers stared at their screens. Their target locks remained active, but their weapons had done nothing. Damage assessments reported zero structural impact on the surface. The energy signature of the barrier flared for a microsecond before fading. It was a planetary shield network of immense power and sophistication, its emitters buried safely deep within the planet's crust. Their first strike, their signature opening move, had been completely neutralized. They had to recalibrate. They had to find a frequency, a weakness. They did not get the chance. Before new firing solutions could be calculated, the planet responded. Across the globe, sections of terrain slid away. Mountain slopes opened. Desert plains parted. Concealed silo doors retracted with a silent, mechanical grace. From these hidden apertures, massive platforms rose into the open air. They were not energy projectors. They were long, rail-thin structures of carbon composite and forged steel. They looked more like industrial construction equipment than weapons of war. These magnetic accelerator cannons took aim. They did not glow with contained energy. They did not hum with power. They operated with a stark, brutal simplicity. A solid tungsten rod, 20 feet long and a foot in diameter, was loaded into the launch chamber. Electromagnetic rails charged for a fraction of a second. Then they fired. There was no bright beam, no visible projectile. The rod was accelerated to a fraction of light speed instantly. It left the atmosphere in near total silence, a hypersonic dart aimed at the fleet above. The first impacts were not explosions. They were penetrations. A Valdris cruiser took a direct hit amidships. The tungsten rod struck its energy shielding. The shields, designed to deflect and diffuse phased energy, offered no resistance. The physical object passed through the barrier as if it weren't there. It struck the ship's armored hull. The kinetic energy was tremendous. The rod did not explode. It pierced the armor, tore through decks and compartments, and exited the other side of the ship a second later. It left a clean, meter-wide hole through the entire vessel. Atmosphere vented. Systems failed. The ship began to drift. Across the formation, other ships met the same fate. Shields that could withstand sustained laser bombardment were useless against a physical object moving at extreme velocity. The Valdris tactical advantage, their superior technology, was rendered null by a weapon that relied on basic physics. Mass times acceleration equals force. It was a primitive concept executed with terrifying precision. Their fleet, built for a war of energy weapons and electronic warfare, was being dismantled by kinetic kill vehicles. They were losing ships not to a superior enemy, but to a simpler one. As the kinetic strikes continued to slam into the Valdris fleet, a separate command sequence activated deep within Earth's command centers. Protocol Omega was not a weapon. It was a strategy of last resort, a set of instructions designed for one scenario: the inevitability of defeat. Its purpose was not to secure victory, but to deny the enemy any value from their conquest. It was the final, grim contingency plan for a species that would rather leave nothing behind than let an enemy profit from their end. The protocol executed with cold efficiency. In cities still under human control, demolition charges pre-planted within power plants, communication hubs, and transit networks received their detonation signals. These were not massive explosions designed for spectacle. They were precise, focused demolitions aimed at critical structural points. The goal was not destruction for its own sake. It was the systematic denial of infrastructure. An invader would not capture a functioning power grid. They would inherit a field of rubble and tangled wreckage. Simultaneously, every central data repository on the planet began a terminal wipe sequence. Terabyte upon terabyte of human knowledge, culture, and history was not merely deleted. It was shredded by encryption algorithms of impossible complexity. The keys instantly destroyed. Billions of lines of code, scientific research, and historical records dissolved into random, meaningless data noise. What could not be encrypted was physically destroyed with thermite charges, reducing server farms to molten slag. The invaders would find no libraries, no databases, no records to loot. Crucial data was not entirely lost. A smaller, more vital stream of information was simultaneously being dispersed. Through hardened, buried fiber optic lines and tight beam laser transmissions, select data packets were shot into a pre-established network of secret archives. These were not centralized. They were scattered across the planet in thousands of isolated, heavily shielded caches, deep in abandoned mines, at the bottom of oceanic trenches, locked in polar ice vaults. This was the ultimate act of remembrance. It ensured that even if the surface was lost, the core of who they were would survive, hidden and waiting. This grand strategy of denial was the purest expression of Admiral Reed's warning. "We will remember" was not a sentimental promise. It was a tactical statement. It meant they would ensure their history and identity could not be erased or captured, even if their bodies were broken and their cities burned. They would carry their legacy into the Earth itself, protecting it from any enemy. It was a declaration that their cultural victory was separate from any military outcome. The Valdris intelligence officers, scanning the planet's communication traffic amidst the chaos of battle, intercepted the coded directives for Protocol Omega. They broke the encryption quickly. The content of the messages was incomprehensible at first. It spoke of scuttle charges and data purges. It detailed the systematic destruction of everything they had come to seize. They reported their findings to Commander Thex, their confusion evident. They were witnessing a civilization actively destroying itself to keep its assets from falling into their hands. The realization struck the command crew with a force greater than any kinetic impact. They were not fighting for a prize. They were fighting for scraps. They were spending ships and warriors to conquer a planet that was methodically turning itself into a worthless ruin before their eyes. The economic and strategic calculation of the entire invasion collapsed in that moment. There would be no resources to replenish their fleet, no technology to reverse engineer, no infrastructure to commandeer, only ash, encrypted data, and a poisoned victory. This psychological blow crippled their will to fight more effectively than any physical weapon. Their doctrine was built on the acquisition of assets. They waged war for gain. Humanity was waging war to ensure there was nothing to gain. The ground invasion, when it came, would not be a campaign of subjugation. It would be a costly, bitter effort to sift through the ruins of a civilization that had chosen to die on its own terms. The goal of conquest had just been rendered null. The battle raged in orbit and across the scarred surface of Earth. Kinetic rounds tore through Valdris hulls. Railgun emitters glowed red-hot from constant firing. Amid this symphony of destruction, a new signal cut across the standard military channels. It was a clean, open broadcast on all frequencies, unencrypted and clear. It was not a demand or a threat. It was a face. A human woman with tired eyes and a calm expression looked out from the screen. She wore a white coat over a simple uniform. This was Dr. Elizabeth Torres, Director of Emergency Medical Services. She spoke without preamble. Her voice was level, devoid of animosity. This is a message to all Valdris personnel. We are monitoring your communications. We hear your distress calls. We know you have wounded stranded on the surface and in disabled vessels. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. It was a simple fact, not a boast. We are offering medical aid and safe evacuation for your injured. Designate your wounded with any available light source. Flares, suit lamps, comm beacons. We will see it. We will send unarmed medical teams. They will collect your wounded and provide treatment. They will not be harmed. You have my word. On the Valdris command ships, officers stared at their screens in disbelief. The transmission was a paradox that their warrior culture could not process. Their doctrine taught that a defeated enemy was to be exploited or eliminated. Mercy was a sign of weakness. Compassion had no place in war. They expected brutality from the humans, a reflection of their own ruthless defense. They expected their wounded to be executed or left to die. This offer of aid was an illogical act. It defied every rule of engagement they understood. The message was repeated on a loop. It played over the sounds of battle and the static of dying ships. Valdris soldiers in disabled dropcraft heard it. Troopers pinned down in hostile terrain heard it. The words created a deep cognitive dissonance. These were the same beings who had just demonstrated the will to tear their own planet apart, to deny victory. They were capable of terrifying total war, yet they were also offering to help their enemies. This contradiction was jarring. It forced individual soldiers to question their perception of the conflict. Was this a trick, a trap, or was it something entirely outside their experience? The act portrayed humanity in a devastating new light. They were not simple savages or noble pacifists. They were something far more complex and unsettling. They were ruthless in their tactics, principled in their conduct. They would destroy a moon to make a point and then offer a bandage to a dying enemy. This duality was a weapon for which the Valdris had no defense. Their psychological profiling had prepared them for an enemy driven by fear or rage. It had not prepared them for an enemy that fought with such grim determination while holding to a code of mercy. This was psychological warfare executed with surgical precision. It targeted not ships or soldiers, but morale and conviction. It aimed to shatter the foundational myth the Valdris held about their opponents and about war itself. They had come expecting to break a weak species. Instead, they were being confronted with a strength they could not categorize. The offer of medical aid forced every Valdris warrior to confront a difficult question. If everything they believed about their enemy was wrong, what else about this war was a lie? The certainty that had fueled their invasion began to erode from within, weakened not by firepower but by a simple, unexpected offer of help. The Valdris ground forces dropped into the Sahara under a blazing sun. Their landing craft touched down on the open sands and armored columns rolled out. They expected a conventional engagement. They anticipated enemy fortifications, massed armor, and clear battle lines. Their doctrine was built for that kind of war. They had scanned the desert from orbit. It was empty. It was perfect terrain for their vehicles and their tactics. They moved out, a formidable force of metal and firepower advancing across the dunes. They did not know they had landed directly on top of their enemy. For decades, human engineers had been preparing this specific region. They had bored tunnels deep beneath the sand. They had installed sensor networks that could track the footfall of a single soldier. They had built hidden armories and command posts. The desert was not empty. It was a meticulously constructed trap designed to negate the Valdris advantage in technology and numbers. The invaders were not entering a battlefield. They were entering a killing field. Colonel James Wright monitored their advance from a control room 200 feet below the surface. His terrain assault specialized Kriegers, the task forces, were already in position. They did not wear heavy armor. They wore sand-colored thermoptic camouflage suits that mirrored the heat signature of the surrounding desert. They were virtually invisible to thermal scans. They waited in hidden hatches, their weapons ready. Their orders were simple: harass, isolate, and eliminate. The first attack came without warning. A section of sand erupted 50 meters from a Valdris patrol. 3 human soldiers rose, fired a volley of rocket-propelled grenades at a troop carrier, and dropped back beneath the surface before the sand settled. The hatch sealed behind them. By the time the Valdris soldiers returned fire, there was nothing to shoot at. The desert was quiet again, save for the burning wreckage of their vehicle. This became the pattern. Attacks came from every direction and from nowhere. Soldiers emerged from the ground, struck, and vanished. Sniper fire picked off officers from impossible distances, the shooters disappearing before a location could be fixed. The Valdris scanners were useless. Their thermal imaging showed only the heat haze of the desert. Their motion sensors were confused by the shifting sands. They were fighting an enemy they could not see or track. The desert itself became an active participant in the fight. Booby traps were everywhere. Pressure-sensitive mines were buried under shallow sand. Tripwires connected to claymore mines were strung between dunes. Water sources were poisoned or rigged with explosives. Every step forward carried the risk of sudden violent death. The Valdris concept of honorable combat, of facing an enemy on an open field, was completely meaningless. This was not a battle of strength against strength. It was a systematic ambush. The psychological effect was devastating. The Valdris soldiers were trained warriors, but they were not prepared for this. They expected to fight an army. Instead, they were fighting a ghost. The constant unseen attacks eroded their discipline and their morale. They began firing at shadows. They hesitated to advance. The relentless stress of being hunted by an invisible enemy took a heavier toll than any direct assault could have. Their armored columns were useless in the soft sand. Their vehicles became stationary targets, easily ambushed and destroyed. Their supply lines were constantly cut. Their casualties mounted with every hour. They were not losing a battle. They were being bled dry by 1,000 small cuts. The campaign was a failure before it had truly begun. The dunes, once seen as an ideal landing zone, became a graveyard for Valdris conventional tactics. They had brought the wrong army to the wrong fight. Their ground forces were being systematically annihilated by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The Sahara was not a conquest. It was a lesson in attrition, written in blood and sand. Earth engaged the Valdris on a second front. While kinetic rounds struck ships and soldiers fought in the sands, a different kind of weapon was deployed. Information became a strategic asset. The Free Earth Broadcasting Network began its transmission. It did not use standard human frequencies. It broadcast on interstellar bands using Valdris communication protocols it had quickly deciphered. The signal was powerful and clear, aimed at the stars. Its intended audience was not the people of Earth. It was every listening post and ship within range of the Sol system. The FEBN feed was a raw, real-time documentation of the invasion. It showed everything. High-definition footage from drones and satellites showed Valdris ships being torn apart by kinetic weapons. It broadcast scenes from the Sahara, where invisible soldiers ambushed and destroyed entire armored columns. It did not edit for propaganda value. It showed human cities burning from orbital strikes. It showed the bodies of human soldiers in the wreckage of their positions. The broadcast was a stark, unflinching look at the true cost of the war for both sides. A central theme emerged from the chaos. The narration provided by a calm, unidentified voice connected the events. It explained human tactics. It detailed the purpose of the deep bunkers and the hidden railguns. It showed Dr. Elizabeth Torres offering medical aid to wounded Valdris troops. These acts of mercy were juxtaposed with scenes of Protocol Omega's systematic demolition of Earth's infrastructure. The message was not complex. It was a direct statement to the galaxy. Observe. Learn from our sacrifice. When they come for you, you will be ready. This transformed the conflict from a secret conquest into a galactic spectacle. The Valdris Empire was accustomed to quick, quiet pacifications. Their wars were private affairs, their methods kept hidden. Now their entire invasion playbook was being broadcast for their rivals and subjects to see. Every tactical decision, every loss, every brutal engagement was public record. The FEBN feed became required viewing across dozens of star systems. Councils and command staffs watched, analyzing both the Valdris approach and the human response. The political and moral isolation of the Valdris was immediate and severe. Their rivals saw the fleet's losses and recognized weakness. Their subject species saw the brutality of the invasion and the ferocity of the resistance. The broadcast created a powerful dichotomy. The Valdris were the aggressors, willing to spend countless lives for a worthless prize. Humanity was the defender, willing to sacrifice everything for principle. The narrative was devastatingly effective. It fostered a deep fear of the Valdris, but also a newfound respect for the terrifying resolve of humanity. The war was no longer contained to the Sol system. It was a lesson playing out on a galactic stage. The FEBN broadcast ensured that the Valdris tactics would never again have the advantage of surprise. Their methods of invasion were now known, their weaknesses exposed. Any future act of aggression would be met by enemies who had studied their every move at the cost of Earth. The conflict ceased to be about the conquest of a single world. It became a public demonstration of the immense, unacceptable cost of attacking a prepared and determined species. The message was clear for any would-be conqueror. Some prey fights back in ways you cannot anticipate, and the price of victory may be your own annihilation. Months dragged into the siege. The tactical displays on the Valdris flagship told a story of victory. The fleet had won every major engagement. They had defeated human squadrons. They had broken blockades. Their ships controlled the space around Earth. The planet was isolated. But the strategic overview told a different story. It was a story written in dwindling numbers and rising costs. The victory was an illusion built on a foundation of unsustainable loss. The fleet's strength had dropped below a critical threshold. The Valdris High Command considered this level the minimum required to maintain a system-wide blockade and support ground operations. They were now well below that line. Replacements were months away, traveling at sub-light speeds from the nearest Imperial shipyard. Every lost cruiser, every damaged frigate was a permanent reduction in their combat power. They were winning battles, but their ability to continue fighting was eroding with each engagement. They controlled the orbit, but they could not control the planet. Their ground forces held ruined cities and vast stretches of empty desert. The victory was hollow. The infrastructure they captured was worthless, destroyed by Protocol Omega. The population was gone, hidden deep underground. Their control was a map exercise. It had no tangible value. They owned the surface, but the planet itself remained hostile, its true power hidden and untouchable. The math of the conflict had become brutally clear. A grim calculation emerged from the fleet's logistics office. For every major human population center their ground forces managed to secure, the fleet lost an average of 3 capital ships. These losses came from the relentless kinetic strikes, from ambushes by hidden defense platforms, from attritional space combat. They were spending irreplaceable warships to conquer radioactive craters and empty husks of cities. The exchange rate was catastrophic. They were trading hardened warships for worthless real estate. This calculation represented a fundamental shift. The math of conquest, which had fueled the Valdris Empire for centuries, no longer favored the invader. Their entire doctrine was based on the principle that the cost of an invasion would be outweighed by the resources and territory gained. That equation was now inverted. The cost was immense. The gain was zero. They were not profiting from this war. They were hemorrhaging resources for no return. Commander Thex studied the latest casualty and expenditure reports. The numbers were stark and undeniable. He finally understood the nature of their error. They were not defeating humanity. Defeat implied the enemy's will or capacity to fight was broken. Humanity's will was as strong as ever. Their capacity to inflict pain was undiminished. They were not breaking the enemy. They were merely purchasing real estate with their own blood. They were spending the lives of their warriors and the hulls of their ships to claim a planet that held nothing for them. The cost of this purchase had become too high. The resource expenditure exceeded any possible gain from the conquest. Even if they somehow achieved total victory, the prize would be a poisoned, resource-depleted world. The economic and strategic value of the entire operation had collapsed. They had won countless battles, but they were decisively losing the war. The objective was no longer victory. The objective had become finding a way to stop the bleeding. The galaxy watched. The Free Earth Broadcast Network carried the war into 1,000 systems. Ruling councils and military commands observed the conflict in real time. They saw the Valdris fleet, a once formidable force, being systematically dismantled. They watched ships explode under kinetic impacts. They saw armored columns vanish in the Sahara sands. The casualty estimates scrolling on their screens were not projections. They were confirmed losses. The Valdris Empire was bleeding itself dry over a single world. They also saw the other side of the equation. They witnessed a species that refused to yield. They watched cities burn and infrastructure vanish into controlled demolitions. They saw the relentless counterattacks from hidden positions. The human defiance was not a brief spasm of resistance. It was a sustained, grim determination to fight to the last breath. The message was clear. Humanity would rather die free than live enslaved. This display of raw, uncompromising will sent a shockwave through interstellar politics. The reaction was immediate and pragmatic. Rival empires saw their opportunity. The Valdris military was overextended, its strength sapped by the war with Earth. Their borders were now vulnerable. Long-standing non-aggression pacts were re-evaluated. Within weeks, rival fleets moved into Valdris frontier systems. They claimed resource-rich planets and strategic jump points. They did not meet significant resistance. The Valdris could not defend their territory and fight a war against humanity simultaneously. Their empire began to shrink. The Galactic Trade Council convened an emergency session. Their decision was swift. They imposed severe economic sanctions on the Valdris Empire for their act of unwarranted aggression. They condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms. But their action did not end there. They also issued a unilateral decree. The Sol system was placed under a strict quarantine. No vessel from any signatory species was to enter the area. No communication was to be attempted. The zone was to be avoided entirely. This was not a protective measure for humanity. It was an act of profound caution. The galaxy was not welcoming a brave new species into the community. They were containing an unpredictable and dangerously resilient power. The message was not one of friendship. It was a message of fear. They had seen what happened when humanity was provoked. They had no desire to become the next Valdris. The quarantine was a buffer, a way to ensure this terrifying force remained contained within its own system. The resolution was stark. Humanity had earned its sovereignty not through diplomacy or cultural exchange. It had earned it through a demonstration of sheer, terrifying will. They had paid for their independence with the blood of their soldiers and the ashes of their cities. The galaxy granted them their freedom because the alternative, trying to take it from them, was a price no one was willing to pay. They were left alone, isolated within their fortified system. They were not welcomed as equals. They were acknowledged as a dangerous force of nature, best left undisturbed. Their sovereignty was born from the ruins of their world and the wreckage of an invading fleet. The conflict ended, not with a surrender ceremony, but with a slow, grinding withdrawal. The Valdris fleet, what remained of it, limped out of the Sol system. In the aftermath, the galactic community searched for a word to describe what had happened. The old terms did not fit. Humanity was not the victors in a traditional sense. Their world was scarred, their population reduced, their cities in ruins. They were not merely survivors either. That word implied passive endurance. What they had done was active, relentless, and terrifying. A new term entered the common lexicon, translated from a dozen languages into a single, fearful concept: the undying. Sometimes eternal warriors. The names captured the essence of the conflict. They had not won by being stronger. They had prevailed by being impossible to kill. This reputation became humanity's most powerful asset. It was a shield more effective than any planetary defense network. The quarantine around the Sol system became a barrier of perception. Other species looked at the humans and saw not a people to be conquered or allied with, but a force of nature to be avoided. Their sovereignty was no longer a question of diplomacy or recognition. It was an accepted fact, born from the demonstrated cost of challenging it. Admiral Marcus Reed led the first official delegation to the Galactic Trade Council. He did not travel as a representative of a defeated world seeking aid. He did not come as a supplicant asking for a place at the table. He arrived as the voice of a sovereign power. His posture throughout the negotiations was that of an equal. His demeanor was calm, his words measured, but his position was absolute. He presented the council with a simple, non-negotiable reality. "We join as equals, or we do not join at all," he stated. The words were not a threat delivered with anger. They were a statement of fact, as cold and precise as the lunar demonstration that had begun the shooting war. He was not bargaining. He was informing them of the conditions for any future interaction. The council members, representatives of species far older and more established, listened. They had seen the data streams from the invasion. They had watched the Valdris Empire crumble under the weight of its own aggression. They understood the subtext of the Admiral's words. The alternative to equal status was a return to conflict, and no one in the room believed that was a fight they could win, or even survive. After a brief, tense deliberation, the council agreed. The terms were accepted. There were no celebrations on Earth. The agreement was logged as a procedural matter. Humanity had earned its place not through cultural exchange, economic power, or diplomatic charm. It had secured its position through pure, credible deterrence. Their strength was not measured in fleet size or technological advancement. It was measured in their demonstrated absolute unwillingness to ever be weak again. They had shown the galaxy that they would rather burn their own world to the ground than allow another to rule it. That was a price no other civilization was willing to pay. And so humanity was granted the respect that price commanded. The lesson of the war was now the foundation of their foreign policy. Peace was maintained not by friendship, but by the certain knowledge of what would happen if it were broken. The reconstruction did not aim to restore the past. The old Earth was gone, its cities scars on the surface. The new civilization rose from the lessons learned underground. Its architecture was not built for beauty or efficiency. It was engineered for survival. Every design choice answered a single question: will this help us win the next war? The blueprint for peace was written in the language of permanent conflict. Dr. Elizabeth Torres now led this effort. Her new command center was buried 3 kilometers beneath the Rocky Mountains, a nerve center connected to sister facilities on every continent. Her focus had shifted from battlefield triage to societal triage. She coordinated not just engineers and soldiers, but economists, psychologists, and city planners. Their unified goal was to build a world that could not be broken. Her authority was absolute, her direction clear. The project was humanity's final and most important defense. The new cities were constructs of concrete and paranoia. They were built deeper, their foundations reaching into the planet's mantle for geothermal power and thermal shielding. Surface access was limited to a few heavily fortified gates. Life existed in vast, self-sustaining arcologies, each capable of surviving a direct orbital strike. Infrastructure was not just hardened, it was redundant. Power grids, water systems, and data networks existed in triplicate, buried far apart and shielded by kilometers of rock. A single broken line could not cripple a sector. In the void above Earth, a new constellation took shape. Orbital shipyards, constructed from salvaged Valdris wrecks and lunar ore, began their work. They did not build exploration vessels or colony ships. They constructed a new fleet designed for a single purpose: defense and retaliatory strike. The ships were leaner, tougher, and armed with the kinetic weapons that had proven so effective. Their design philosophy was pure function. They were shields and spears, nothing more. Their presence in the solar system was a permanent declaration of readiness. The trauma of the invasion was not buried. It was channeled. The memory of lost cities and fallen soldiers was etched into the core of the new education system. Children learned engineering alongside history, tactics alongside mathematics. They were taught that vigilance was the price of existence. Compassion for one another remained a core value, but vulnerability to outsiders was systematically eliminated. Trust was for humans. Caution was for the stars. The society became a single organism, its culture and its defense strategy inseparable. This unwavering vigilance was the only response to the galaxy's caution. The quarantine zone around the Sol system was respected, but it was also monitored. Sensor arrays and unmanned patrol drones watched the boundaries. The message was clear. Humanity would stay within its borders, but it would never again be blind to what lay beyond. They would not provoke, but they would be prepared. The peace was an armed standoff maintained by the silent, credible threat emanating from the fortified world and its waiting fleet. The lesson of the Valdris invasion was now the foundation of all global policy. Every law, every allocation of resources, every diplomatic communique was filtered through a single lens. Does this make us stronger? The concept of a peacetime economy was abolished. The entire civilization operated on a permanent wartime footing, though the war was a memory. Peace was not the absence of conflict. It was a state of constant readiness achieved through the demonstrated capacity to inflict an unacceptable cost. They had traded the comfort of a quiet world for the security of an unbreakable one. Earth launched a new broadcast a standard year after the last Valdris ship left the system. The transmission was not a plea for peace. It was not an offer of alliance. It carried no diplomatic overtures. It was a strategic message of pure deterrence, a cold statement of fact aimed at every listening post in the galaxy. Its purpose was simple. It was to ensure the war was not an end, but a definitive beginning. The signal was broadcast on all FTL bands. It began with Admiral Marcus Reed's original transmission, his face and warning unedited. Humans do not give up. We rebuild, we learn, we remember. His words were followed by a stark, data-driven account of the conflict. It listed Valdris losses in exacting detail. It quantified the ships destroyed, the troops lost, the resources expended. It showed the economic and political collapse of their empire. It presented the invasion not as a battle, but as a financial and strategic disaster of the highest order. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The broadcast served a single function. It was a deterrent to any other would-be conqueror. It detailed the catastrophic price the Valdris paid for their aggression. It made the cost of attacking Earth a matter of public galactic record. The message was not a boast. It was a warning etched in the wreckage of a fleet and the ruin of an empire. It was a ledger of failure for any species arrogant enough to think they could succeed where the Valdris had failed. The broadcast concluded with a visual of Earth's scarred surface, the ruins of cities standing as silent monuments. Admiral Reed's voice returned for the final line. It was delivered with the same flat, uncompromising tone as the first time. We remember. The phrase landed with the weight of a tectonic shift. It was not a promise of vengeance. It was a declaration of permanent readiness. It was a statement that the lesson of the invasion was now encoded into human DNA. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of empty space. This final act ensured the conflict would define humanity's future. The war was not a historical event to be studied and forgotten. It was the foundation of a new, unyielding era. It transformed human civilization from a collection of nations into a single, hardened entity. Their society was now a monument to vigilance. Their entire culture was oriented around a single principle: never again. The broadcast was the public declaration of that new reality. It was the signal that humanity's period of vulnerability was over. The galaxy received the message with the gravity it was intended. There were no debates in council chambers. There were no proposals for diplomatic missions. The warning was understood in its entirety. The data was clear and verifiable. The Valdris Empire was a shadow of its former self, its strength broken against the rocks of a single world. The conclusion was inescapable. To attack Earth was to invite your own destruction. The cost was not merely defeat. It was economic collapse, political ruin, and the very real possibility of extinction. The message achieved its goal. It made aggression against humanity an act of strategic suicide. The quarantine zone around the Sol system became a wall of shared understanding. It was a border defined not by treaties but by fear and respect for a species that had proven it could not be broken. The story of the Valdris invasion passed into legend. It became required study at military academies across the galaxy. Historians and strategists pored over every transmission, every tactical decision. They analyzed the weapons, the fortifications, the battle plans. They created complex simulations, but the data always led to the same unsettling conclusion. The key lesson was not found in technology or tactics. It was a flaw in fundamental assessment. The critical error was a miscalculation of spirit. The Valdris measured strength in claws, armor, and energy output. They quantified power in fleet size and shield capacity. They had no metric for will. They could not scan for resilience. Their sensors could not detect the stubborn refusal to yield that was humanity's true defense. This blind spot in their intelligence was more fatal than any weapon. It was a philosophical failure that doomed their entire campaign. The economic and political strain of the war proved too much for the Valdris Empire. The cost in ships and warriors was catastrophic. The loss of prestige was absolute. Their rivals, seeing their weakness, carved up their border territories. Internal factions began to war over the dwindling resources. The empire that had set out to conquer a world collapsed inward under the weight of its own ambition. Their defeat was not just military, it was systemic. The invasion bankrupted them in every way that mattered. Humanity, meanwhile, looked out at the stars with a new permanent caution. Their world was scarred, their population greatly reduced. The surface was a graveyard of ruined cities and silent monuments. But their posture was not one of defeat. It was one of grim vigilance. They had paid a terrible price for their survival. That price had purchased a harsh wisdom. They would never again be caught unprepared. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. They had bled more than any species could have imagined. They had sacrificed their cities, their history, and billions of lives. They had willingly turned their planet into a fortress and their culture into a weapon. The suffering was immeasurable. The loss was a permanent scar on their collective soul. But through it all, through every bombardment and every lost battle, one thing remained constant. The concept of surrender never entered the equation. It was not an option that was considered, debated, or even mentioned. It was an impossibility. This absolute refusal to break became the core of their galactic identity. The warning was not a boast. It was a simple statement of observed fact. Humans may bleed, they may suffer catastrophic losses, they may see their world burn around them, but they will never, ever break. This was the ultimate lesson of the conflict. It was a lesson that reshaped galactic politics and military doctrine for centuries to come. The proof of this lesson was written in the ruins of two empires. The Valdris Empire was gone, its territories divided, its legacy one of catastrophic failure. Their mighty fleet was scrap metal orbiting 100 worlds. Earth stood, wounded but unbroken, a fortified sentinel in a now quiet system. The contrast was stark. One empire fell because it believed strength was only about power. One species survived because it understood strength was about endurance. The warning echoed into the void, a permanent reminder of the cost of miscalculation. The galaxy had learned that some enemies cannot be defeated, only survived. The Valdris invasion taught the galaxy a severe price for aggression, collapsing their empire after a catastrophic defeat on Earth. Humanity's victory was not built on weapons, but on sacrifice and an unbreakable will to endure. Admiral Reed's warning came true. Humans rebuild, learn, and remember. Their strength lies not in armor or claws, but in a refusal to ever yield. Remember this lesson the next time you assume power is only about visible force. True resilience is measured in spirit, and some wars are lost long before the first shot is ever fired.